And thank you all for joining. We expected a very small crowd today. We're so excited to see so many of you joining us. I think it maybe feels like we're all in the waiting room, and maybe this data today will help us see how we can find our way out. I'm Tim Shriver. I'm very proud to be part of the team at Unite, now focused on the implementation of and the scaling of and the engagement of our country with the Dignity Index, with the concept that we don't just have a problem, but we also have a way out. I'm also in a house that has dogs. I'm very grateful to be joined today by Tom Rochert, who you just heard. You'll hear from in a little bit. But I'm also grateful that over the last several years, we've had the great friendship and partnership of More in Common. More in Common is well known around the country and indeed around the world for having done some of the most sensitive and most careful polling that examines our tribal identities, if you will, the ways in which we're different, the ways in which we are different even within our political parties from each other. But also, More in Common has helped us understand that we're not as different as sometimes we think we are. And they've done pioneering research in this regard. Today, we have a poll which we've done together, Unite and More in Common, working together to understand Americans' interest in overcoming polarization. Where do they stand? We hear people say they care, they want change, they're exhausted, they're starving for an alternative. We wanted to explore those questions a little more deeply and come to understand whether people think we actually can get out, and if so, how. So I'm very grateful today to be joined by a research associate from More in Common, Paul Oshinski. Paul works on large sample size research projects as well as focus groups. He holds a master's from the University of Texas. That's probably all I need to say. But he's worked in political campaigns and in political polling for his professional career. Paul, we'll look to you to present the data. I'll be looking at the Q&A and maybe even interrupting a little bit as we get into the data. I hope everyone on the audience will get a chance to chew on this as you go through it. And I look forward to the conversation. Paul, over to you. What have we learned so far?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim, for the kind introduction. And yes, please interrupt throughout. I will not be offended. And as Tim mentioned, I'm Paul. I'm a researcher, and my background is really in survey research. And we're excited to share some results today of some findings from a survey platform where we tested the Dignity Index. And I'm going to go ahead and share screen here and make sure this is operating correctly. Okay. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I thought that I was a panelist, so I don't know, Dan, if you can make me a host, if that's possible.
I'll share my screen and then you can tell me when to advance.
Okay, sure. Awesome. So we can just already go ahead and go to the next slide. And I know that probably a lot of folks may not be familiar with our survey research platform. So I just wanted to kind of make space to explain it since it's a bit unconventional compared to kind of more traditional polling. So we call our research platform Americans in Conversation. And it's in September, we launched a research community of approximately 150 Americans representative of the US adult population. And you can kind of think of this as a panel of Americans where we field weekly surveys to them, usually 5 to 7 minutes. And our goal is to really understand their views on various political topics, but also kind of their core beliefs in psychology. So this includes asking them to react to content as well as their views on issues and events. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And we fielded a survey on the Dignity Index just last month in mid-November, and we had about 130 people take this activity. And what participants did was they reviewed content from the Dignity Index. This included a brief description of the index, as well as an image of the different scale options for the Dignity Index. And participants left these kind of longer paragraph form responses to these different pieces of content as well as, different emoji responses. So really catering to our Gen Z participants a little bit. But we just have a lot of data here that we want to get into. We had over 1,000 individual responses from this activity. So really a lot to unpack. And in the analysis, we really tried to focus on kind of these deeper open-ended responses. Instead of showing you more traditional polling statistics, we do have a little bit of that we'll share. But yeah, I think the real power of this research platform is these longer form responses. So we go to the next slide. So this is kind of just summarizing some of the questions that we asked participants. So again, we had participants review the dignity index description as well as the scale. We asked, their general reaction to this idea of a dignity index, how we described it. If people found this trustworthy and a credible tool to measure dignity, as well as thinking about use cases about using the dignity index in a political race, and would this be something that participants would use and trust, as well as thinking about political bias. Do people trust these scores? Do they trust the scoring panel? We can go to the next slide. So these are just a few more questions. We wanted to probe people just on the importance of speaking with dignity, if people think it is important, as well as, would people use the dignity index in determining who to vote for, if they'd like to see it in, different news articles, things like that. So we'll be able to share a little bit more about that later. And go to the next slide. So I just want to run through a few kind of key findings before we jump into some of the quotes from the activity. So just kind of the first one I mentioned is people like the dignity index. They think it's valuable, a really interesting and kind of unique tool. Of course, there are people who say, they're not interested in it. And I think we're going to kind of look into the reasons why they aren't. But I think it's just kind of useful to see that this is a tool most Americans find appealing, as long as we're able to speak to some of the different concerns that people have about this index with bias and things like that. So I think another thing to mention is probably no surprise to anyone on this call is that people think dignity is a lost art these days. When you think about the political ecosystem, news media, social media, things like that, people don't see dignity. And I think, that's a great problem statement for this work, which is, there's a desire for dignity, but people really don't seem to see it anywhere. And then jumping into those questions of, actually using the dignity index, a majority of participants say that they would use the index in at least helping to decide who to vote for. And I think that's a really cool finding. And obviously, this is a smaller sample size and something to be kind of probed further in larger work, but really promising kind of selling point for the index. And I think what's also really exciting, and we'll get into this later, is that a lot of panelists really want to see this during the election season. People say this is the moment where dignity disappears with attack ads and debates. So I think in the run up to 2024 and beyond, this is really a tool that Americans would find useful. We can go to the next slide. And, some of the hesitations that participants had with the index, I think one is usage. People, think that, those who don't speak with dignity, those who they think are, on the extremes are not going to use this. And I think, there is a large amount of Americans who are kind of politically disengaged. So from those Americans' perspective, there's just kind of a less of an interest in following politics more generally. So less of kind of a reaction to the dignity index, more of a reaction to I'm not interested in politics. I'd also mention, there's a lot of concerns about bias and how this could be used. I think answering those with, who's on the panel, why should we trust the, panel? What's the political makeup? Is this diverse? Things like that is going to be really important for explaining the dignity index. I would also mention, I think, and this came from kind of the more conservative realm, especially stronger conservatives, given, tech and, different tools that people have, is this something that could silence people? And I think that's something we've seen in our research outside of this project on conservatives, especially with new tech and platforms. There's, a concern about free speech. And then the last thing I'd mention is impact. And I think a lot of people really like this idea, but there's a concern of, why would a candidate care about this? And I think probably Tom and the Unite team could say more about the, purpose of the index and how it's not geared at kind of a top-down approach. But I think it's useful to note that, this is something participants see as a problem in elected officials, not using dignity. So I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide here. Before we get into it, just kind of one more slide here about our hidden tribe segmentation, and many people may not be familiar. And this is basically a segmentation we use to break down the US population, not in the traditional way of Democrat versus Republican, but using things like core beliefs, moral values, psychology to better kind of capture the nuances of the US population. You can see some of the descriptors of the 7 hidden tribes. There, we have progressive activists on the left, traditional and devoted conservatives on the right. And, these are groups in what we call the wings. And in the middle, you can see we call that the exhausted majority, which is the roughly 2 in 3 Americans who are exhausted by political division and open to compromise. And related to the dignity index, we saw that, the hidden tribes groups most interested in it are, traditional passive liberals, people in the exhausted majority. We did see, a little bit less interest among people on the wing groups, and also that group in the middle, politically disengaged. So people less interested in politics. So I think, there's perhaps different framings for the index that could be useful for, some of these different groups. Go to the next slide. We can actually flip one more, and I was just going to show kind of, this is the content that we tested, and we have the scale on the left and the index description on the right. And, there's 2 things you can see here. And on the scale, you can see that, people are reacting really favorably to the 6 to 8 description of the scale. But obviously, a lower reaction to the lower scale items. And the second thing is, I know there's a lot of crazy emojis on the screen, but people in general resonated and liked the dignity index description. And, as you can see, most of the reaction here are positive, and we'll get into the open-ended responses in a sec. So we can go ahead and, Dan, if you want to flip to the quotes on the next slide. Great. So yeah, these are just some of the reactions people had. Most people cite kind of religious reasons, moral justifications for why dignity matters. We see here, I think that's Melissa on the top right, that says, this is what my faith teaches, and I believe it is the right attitude for all of us to have towards each other if we're going to live in the best world possible. And I think kind of the takeaway from these quotes is, a reassurance that dignity really is an important shared value among most Americans. This is something people want to see in politics and in the world more generally. So we can go to the next slide. And yeah, I mean, this is just a reiteration of that. People want dialogue in politics to be in that 6 to 8 realm on the index scale. Art says at the top there, lower scale numbers cause division and make harmony impossible. Strength comes from understanding, first, that every voice deserves a chance to be heard, an opportunity to be present in order to learn new perspectives. So we can go to the next slide. And just kind of, there were smaller nuance points about specific statements, but just want to, highlight some participants who mention, is there a limit to dignity? I think Gordon here at the top right, reacting to the scale, saying, I could see some of the more contemptuous comments used for, violent crimes and things like that. So, some people do say there is a limit to dignity, but, it's kind of a smaller nuance point that we saw in the data. So we can flip just one more if that's okay. Great. And, this is some of the reactions to the description of the index. And in general, again, it was clear from both the responses, but also the different reactions people gave that, this was a really positive thing that people read. I think Holly said, "I'm glad there's a panel for this during next year's election." And I think the two quotes under that also kind of show that, people are glad that this is around during the election season. As I mentioned, many people see this as a really toxic time. So, potentially something to highlight as part of the index is that, this is geared towards the contempt that we typically see in an election season. So we can go to the next slide. So obviously, some people, yeah, perfect. Some people have some concerns that, will this matter? I think Eason there says, "I'm hopeful this will matter, but when you have cable news networks watched by millions not reporting the news, I'm skeptical." Others, we saw a lot of responses about, this is great, but, there's a, billion-trillion-dollar hate industrial complex out there. So, being able to fight against that, I think, is a concern that people have with this index is, how do we make this more popular and prevalent and fight back against the contempt that is so common these days in the political ecosystem. So maybe I would say probably one of the most frequent questions in the activities, who is scoring? Who is, in this panel that's deciding what is dignity versus contempt? So something that we're thinking about is how to, explain in detail to speak to some of the concerns that folks have about, how is this being scored and who is scoring it? So we can go to the next, I think there's a data slide coming up. Actually, Dan, is it okay if you go to kind of the bottom of the presentation? Is that possible? I think it's about like slide 42. Great. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of share before we get into any more of the quotes, some of the reactions that people had to the Dignity Index in general. Over half of people say that they would use the Dignity Index when considering who to vote for in future elections. 64% say they would use the Dignity Index or, would like to see it in articles and sources that they follow. About half, so, slightly less people would say they would kind of use it in less political context. So in, using it in what people say. And then at the bottom, those two statements is just kind of a reiteration of the, shared value that Americans have. They, care about contempt and really do not want to see, contempt because it causes divisions and problems in America. So, Dan, I'm sorry I'm asking a lot for you, but if you don't mind kind of navigating back, if that's possible. Great. Let me just double check we're on the right slide here. Do you mind going to the next one, Dan? Sorry about that. Great. So yeah, these are kind of the first reactions to the question of, what is your reaction to the Dignity Index? And again, most people like this idea. People like the idea of the scale. And then I think I mentioned a little bit earlier about, conservatives' response to this. And I think for the most part, we don't see any big partisan differences. But when you look at those hidden tribes wing groups, so Brandon at the bottom right is a devoted conservative, and he has this concern, as one or two other devoted conservatives have, about this being a silencing tool. And I think that might be something to speak to with that specific group. But again, with kind of the more moderate conservatives in our panel and in our hidden tribe segmentation, we don't see that concern as prevalent. Great. So again, these are just some more reactions to the idea of the Dignity Index. And I think one of the concerns that other people had is, they love the idea of it, but have a concern that people on the extremes or people that speak with contempt may not be interested in this index and may not care about this index. So I think this is more about a perception of, how this would be viewed by more extreme groups and people who would care. But again, just a few hesitations that participants had in this way. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight some of the questions we asked people. Do you have any questions about the Dignity Index after we've shown you, all of this content? And here are some of the common ones. People say, is this accepted by both parties? A lot of questions on, who created or who's behind the Dignity Index. Questions about, who are the participants in there, scoring, things like that. So yeah, I think those are kind of the big ones, and we can go to the next slide. And we asked, do you think the Dignity Index is a trustworthy and credible tool to measure dignity in what political candidates say? And most participants do think this is a trustworthy tool as long as it's used correctly. And I think if we actually go to the next slide here. Great. So this is, a question or something that we saw across the activity, and the panel is a big question mark. People want it to be neutral and not biased, and some people have a concern that people who look at this index might use it for their own political advantages. So really kind of answering this question about who's behind the panel and who is on the panel is going to be really important for how Americans view this. We can actually go to the next slide. I think I was just going to do a few more because I definitely want to leave space for any questions, any comments that Tim or Tom would have. So we also asked, in the context of reading an article on a political race or, comparing two political candidates' speeches, would you trust the scores? Why or why not? And really, most people seem to trust the index in this context, and looking at two different candidates' speech. Though, a lot of people in these quotes, as you can see, mention that it wouldn't be the only thing they'd use to form their opinion. So I think that's kind of an important part that, this index is, not a tool that's being presented as a be all and end all for, deciding who to vote for or deciding people's views on a political candidate. This is just kind of one of the tools in a, full tool belt of ways that people look at political candidates and elected officials in general. So we can go to the next slide. Again, this is the same question. You see that people would really trust the scores as long as, again, they know who's part of the scoring process. And again, that it's, not the only tool that they'd use to decide who's speaking with dignity. So we asked, I think I just have a few more here. Some have argued that the index scores will be subject to political bias, and what would make you more trusting that the scores are objective? And people really want a diverse, bipartisan group. People want to know who's behind the index. Obviously Stanton at the bottom says if we had more than one person and more than one political side to evaluate the dignity, it's important. Go to the next slide. And again, we see the same concern about, politicians exploiting the index. Mick here says, some people in influential positions are going to try and twist it and mold it to their personal agenda. So I think really being kind of clear that, this is not for any particular candidate or campaign is important to kind of speak to those hesitations people have. So I think I'll just wrap up with these two slides because I want to make sure we have enough time for everything. We said, could you ever see yourself using the index to score, levels of dignity in what candidates say? And again, most people say they'd use it, which is really great. Some people say, not just in political speech, but also for their personal use, they'd be interested in that. So it's kind of cool to see different use cases for this tool. So I think I know I had a few more slides, but I'm probably just going to wrap up there. So maybe Tim, I don't know if there's questions or if you want to add anything, but yeah, thanks again.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Q&A has been terrific. I've been trying to keep up as best I can, but I'm going to turn it over to Tom for comments. Just to quickly summarize a couple of the points. There are several questions about reliability and validity, several questions about the diversity of the panel. Paul, maybe you could speak a little bit to that. Is it representative of people of different races and backgrounds and cultures and so on? There's a lot of questions about, is it unbiased and how does it compare to other instruments that are out there? And then a lot of questions about what are we going to do with tech? What are we going to do with the algorithm? Like, this is all fine and well, but how do we engage with technology in a way that will make this have some scalability or some power? But those are some of the broad questions. Tom, I think it would be great if we heard your comments, and just as someone who spent so much time developing this, and thinking through all the different elements of the stages, but also, what this is and what it isn't. No one's more articulate on that than Tom Rochard. So, Tom, can you come off mute and come on camera and share with us a few thoughts before we wrap it up?
Yeah, happy to do that, and really delighted to see so many people joining us. I'm a former White House speechwriter. I became very troubled by the rising hostility in the country, and I became a co-creator with Tim Shriver and Tammy Pfeiffer of the Dignity Index. And I want to take just 2-3 minutes to explain why I found the data from this More in Common survey that we just heard from Paul so encouraging. And this goes to some of our founding principles at Unite. We had to inquire, look, if we want to form a society, big or small, we have to have some common values, or there's no chance for community. So as we thought through the project of trying to bring more unity in a country of so much diversity, we had to ask ourselves, what is the minimum possible agreement we need to have to form a society? What common values are indispensable? And we think, ultimately, and we came to think, we need only one. Everyone should be treated with dignity. That's the only agreement we believe we need to have to build a successful society. More than that is not necessary. Less than that is not enough. Because if we treat each other with dignity, we can listen carefully, we can speak honestly, and we can solve any problem. So as we work across the United States to share the Dignity Index with people and see if they resonate to the idea of dignity and see if they agree what the term dignity means, we're actually posing a very large question. Is the United States of America a viable proposition? If we do not treat each other with dignity, one of two things will happen. Unity will crush diversity, as it does in dictatorships, or diversity will crush unity, as it does in failed states. But if people agree on the principle of treating others with dignity and can agree on what dignity is, then we can have a unity that will survive our diversity. So dignity for us is an inalienable right alongside life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So here's where I see tremendous good news in Paul's presentation. 81% of the people that Paul talked to strongly or somewhat agreed that contempt increases division and causes problems, and that dignity eases division and solves problems. And he learned that 61% strongly agree or somewhat agree that if we put a spotlight on dignity and contempt, we will use more dignity and less contempt. And that's good news, because as soon as we start to use more dignity and less contempt, we start to expect dignity from the people around us. And that's when we can start creating a constituency that rewards dignity. And that's when the culture of contempt can start to change. So thanks very much. I'm very excited by what Paul's finding out.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom. Paul, say a little bit more about this issue of free speech. I think we heard a lot of that early on in the work, not as much more recently. Tom has a that our view is that the biggest threat in the country right now to free speech or the free expression of principles is not the government, it's actually contempt. It's that we're afraid of the repercussions of expressing our views. We're afraid of the hatred and contempt of the other side, and we feel silenced by fear and contempt much more than we do by regulation or by control mechanisms. Can you say a little bit more about how the panel responded to this issue of uh, fearing that a way of scoring each other on dignity would actually lead to, or might risk not being able to express our views?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, but conservatives, especially as I mentioned in our hidden tribe segmentation, devoted conservatives who are much stronger conservative values, things like that. There is a concern, and I think this is probably based on things that have happened in the past with tech, YouTube, things like that. There's a concern of this being some sort of silencing tool for specific candidates. So I think what we also saw in the data is regardless of political party, regardless of conservatism, liberalism, where you stand on the hidden tribes, there's really a shared value of dignity, and also a concern that people don't see this in the media, in social media, in any of these kind of political ecosystems. So I think while that's kind of a specific concern among that group, people across the board really value dignity and really don't see it in politics.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I know we were hoping to do this in 30 minutes, so we would be very careful with everyone's time, but no one's leaving, so I think we can go on a little bit longer. Talk a little bit more about this issue of voting. Yeah, you mentioned, Paul, that people were about having this be a factor in their voting, but not the only factor. We've never suggested that you would vote in a rote way for a person who scores higher or lower, but only that we would be introducing a new issue in to the deliberation people have about who they vote for, that they would consider. They might consider environmental record, tax record, they might consider values, they might consider immigration, they might consider school board policies, whatever. We're trying to suggest not that all those issues be eclipsed, but rather that they just add one. Did that come through with the panel? Did they understand that this wouldn't be something they would control their vote, but rather inform their vote?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really a lot of people saw this as a tool. And, as we saw in the data, over half of people would say that they would use the dignity index in deciding who to vote for, not as, the determinative factor. I don't think I would use the dignity index to decide who to vote for. There's a lot more that goes into deciding who to vote for. And that's not, what the purpose of the dignity index is. But I think as we saw in the data, most Americans would use this, would look at this, and in their kind of complex analysis of deciding, their votes, and also just kind of looking in the news and things like that.
Yeah. So Renee, she's listed as Renee Gogo, so I guess that's how I'll say it. Renee has brought up a really important point, which is, that what we find, Paul, is that people get interested in this and we ask them about politics, but pretty quickly they shift to themselves. How can I use this in my life? What do I need to do to my friend or my spouse or my partner or my kids or my parents, whoever it is, or my coworkers? How do I change them? But then quite quickly, people go, wait a second, how do I change me? Because as Tom pointed out, Nix has a way of kind of revealing that we have, that I have contempt. Oh my God, I didn't see I thought I was the good guy, not the bad person, right? But Renee's asking this question about how do we help people move up? Like, okay, now we see it. I see that I've been using contempt. I'm not happy about it. I know maybe why I got trapped in this. Did any of the respondents start to ask questions about how they could use this in a way as a mirror for themselves, but also as a way of maybe recovering their own sense of dignity so they could give it to others? Any of that come through?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if I showed the slide, but there was a great quote from a participant who was mentioning how she would love to use this, for her own personal use. And I think she was mentioning in her phone for texts. And I think that is kind of one of the first steps. And I know this participant was mentioning, how in the past she's probably used contempt in the way she's talked to people about different things, from politics to, a conversation with a friend. And I think I'd say that, that's kind of one of the first steps, is to, notice that this is something that happens to everyone. And I think accepting that is part of the first step. But I don't know. I think Tom could probably speak a little more to the transformative nature of the Dignity Index and how that can affect people. But I would also mention that, one of our colleagues, our chief of staff, Kate, after, reading about the Dignity Index, and I can say this for myself too, has been noticing more people's speech, and when it does have dignity and when it does have contempt. And simply reading about the Dignity Index can make you kind of more aware of the idea of, that existing in speech.
Well, sure. It's the transformative experience that we think we can create with the Dignity Index is basically premised on the idea that you're going to get an insight that says, wow, I never thought of it this way before, but contempt causes division, and I contribute to contempt, so I can help solve the problem. And once people get that sense of it, they, as I said earlier, they start to expect it from the people around them, and that's how it can snowball. That's, that is a personal moment. It's not a national movement, but it's the personal moment of which national movements are made.
Did you notice, Paul, in the larger hidden tribes data, you talk about the exhausted majority? I like the term starving majority because it implies desire. Do you see examples of people wishing they could make a difference? Like, even if they're checked out, wanting to contribute, looking for pathways, feeling like they would respond if opportunities were given to them to make a difference?
I would say, yeah. I think, again, our exhausted majority segment, which is 2 in 3 Americans, it's a lot of people. It's most of the country. I think it's a group of people who's, again, exhausted by division and really looking for a way out. So I think any tool that potentially helps, get us out of the kind of modes of polarization that we're so used to is something that people really crave. And we definitely saw that in the data with the Dignity Index.
Yeah. I just want to also point out, I think we didn't really mention it in detail, but we did test, there were some questions about reliability and validity. We did test this index over the course now of almost 2 years of testing the validity questions. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? Are we getting accurate answers based on what the instrument is designed to measure? And testing whether it works multiple times, whether it works across different raters. We can get rid of, surprisingly, I mean, this may be surprising to people on the call, we can get rid of bias pretty quickly by training people how to use this. And the best evidence of that is that we find ourselves judging ourselves negatively when we've done. It's like you don't need to hide any longer. You don't need to say, well, wait a minute, I love that candidate, therefore she or he couldn't be filled with contempt. You go, oh, wait a minute, I like that candidate, but that was a really contemptuous statement. And we don't. This is an important point Tammy makes in the chat also. The Dignity Index doesn't judge people. It judges speech, right? So we don't end up with a score for Tom. Tom isn't himself a 5 or a 7 or an 8 or a 2. He may use 2 language sometimes in meetings. He does. No, just kidding. But we don't judge the person. And we think that's a really important distinction here. And I think it's something that would be really helpful if our country, if we could figure out how to separate judging people from judging points of view. And in our case, just judging how we characterize each other. That's our exclusive interest. And it seems like it's small, but this data suggests it's pretty big. it's pretty tantalizing for folks.
It's also, I would just add, it's a lot of fun. If you are surrounded by people who know the index and know your commitment to try and speak with greater dignity, and you slip up and you say, what's wrong with those people? You get 3 people around you saying, ha ha, and you catch it very quickly. You can't get away with it anymore.
It's very, very funny in that way. A little bit humiliating sometimes. I was in a presentation not too long ago with a very senior team, University of Utah, and I was talking about some issue, and I was going into what some of the problems we're facing, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but someone in the boardroom raised it, Tim, you just dropped to a 3, and I was like, oh no, you know, but it was true. She didn't attack me. She just said I just used 3 language, which is, you know, it's us versus them. And, you know, maybe sometimes you might say to yourself, well, I want to use that language or I need to use that language. But at least now you're conscious of the fact that's the kind of language you're using, that you've slipped out of talking about the issue and you've slipped into talking about others as though they're the problem. And the more we're conscious of that, I think the better chance we have of finding our way through it. So, Paul, last words. I know we've gone way over what I was thinking we would spend on this, but we will make this data available. I think we'll post. We've invited people in the chat if you have comments about either this webinar or interest in more conversations to follow up. We'd love them. We hope to do more of this in 2024. We've had a lot over the last year of work done in the index, but we haven't gotten it to you, those folks who can help us, as much as we should have. So we're looking to do a better job of that. We'd welcome your suggestions and thoughts as to how we ought to pursue all this. So, Paul, last word goes to you.
I don't think I have much more to share other than, you know, we're continuing to do research on this. We're looking at how people respond to specific scores and specific passages. So just to say, we have a lot more data coming and it's really exciting. So maybe back over to you, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Tom, for joining us. Dan, welcome back to the Unite team. Thanks for organizing us, Marianne, and everyone, and mostly for all of you who joined us. We'll be posting this so people can go back and look at the data, and we'll also try to make the data as accessible and available to folks as we can. If you're celebrating holidays, we wish you a joyful and dignity-filled celebration. If there's tension around your holiday tables, encourage you to pull out a little copy of the index and try to use it around your dining room tables and with your family members. For those of us who have tried that, we found it to be an enormously powerful way to help improve our own communication and in some ways get rid of or reduce the toxins even in our own families, which have been so painful. So from all of us, we join you in wishing you and your family as much dignity and as much joy as possible during these days.